Montana sells itself as the last best place. Big sky, empty highways, mountains that look like they were painted on. And for a lot of the state, that's completely true. But Montana is also enormous, bigger than Germany, with barely over 1 million people in it. And buried inside all that natural beauty are towns dealing with some of the roughest, strangest, and honestly most heartbreaking stories in the entire country. And several of the towns near the bottom of this list sit on or near Montana's Indian reservations, and their poverty and unemployment numbers are genuinely staggering. That's not a reflection on the people or the culture there. It's simply the direct result of decades of federal trust land policy and historic disinvestment that economists and journalists have written about for years. With that said, let's count down 15 of the toughest places to live in Montana. Number 15 is Shelby, a small highline town with around 3,200 people. For a town this size, property crime is surprisingly high. Estimates put the risk at about 1 in 29, which means theft and other property crimes are a real concern here. Shelby also depends heavily on the Crossroads Correctional Center, a privately run prison that provides an important share of local jobs and income. Then there is transportation. Shelby sits on an Amtrak rail line, and for people who do not drive, that train is basically the main way in and out. When service cuts were discussed in 2020, local leaders warned that losing those jobs would hit the town hard. And that is the bigger problem with Shelby. There are not many backup options. When so much depends on a private prison and a single rail connection, even one major change can hurt the whole town. Number 14 is Roundup, a small Montana town with fewer than 1,800 people, and the population has been shrinking for years. The biggest problem is that Roundup depends heavily on the Signal Peak coal mine. That mine provides a major share of the jobs in the area, so when its permit became tied up in a federal court fight, hundreds of local jobs suddenly looked uncertain. And in a town this small, losing even a few hundred jobs is not a small event. It affects families, local shops, housing, schools, and almost every other part of the local economy. That is what makes Roundup vulnerable. There are not many other large employers waiting to take over if the mine slows down or closes. Unemployment is already higher than many communities would want, household incomes are relatively weak, and the town has been losing people for more than 2 decades. So Roundup's problem is not simply that it is a small town. It is that too much of its future depends on one industry, and when that industry becomes uncertain, the entire town feels it. Number 13 is Malta, a Phillips County town of roughly 2,000 people that shows up on nearly every worst places in Montana list ever published. For the same reasons every time unemployment as high as 9%, one of the lowest median home values in the entire state at around $126,000, and a level of remoteness where the nearest full-service hospital is hours away. Malta isn't famous for any one disaster. It's just quietly, consistently struggling, year after year, and is the kind of town that never climbs off the bottom of the list either. Number 12 is Great Falls, and this one might surprise you because it's actually Montana's 4th largest city, not a tiny outpost. But Great Falls has the highest property crime count of any city in the state, and local reporting found crimes against persons up 25% and aggravated assaults up 21% over an 8-year stretch, while officers' actual proactive patrol time shrank to roughly 10% of a shift and detectives were juggling 55 to 60 cases each. Great Falls never fully recovered from 2 gut punches decades apart, a copper smelter shutting down in 1981 and the local Air Force Base runway going dark in 1997. The population has basically flatlined between 57 and 61,000 people since the year 2000, and in the most recent count, it actually lost residents. Number 11 is Colstrip, and this is a town that has depended on coal for almost everything. For years, the local mine and the coal-fired power plant provided most of the jobs, much of the tax money, and a huge part of the town's identity. But that dependence is now becoming a problem. 2 of the plant's 4 units have already shut down, and the companies that still buy power from Colstrip are gradually moving away from coal. At the same time, coal revenue in the region has been falling, and the town has been losing population. So Colstrip is facing a very simple but serious question. What happens when the industry that built the town starts disappearing? Even the mayor has said they do not want Colstrip to be known only for its smokestacks. And that says a lot. Because right now, those smokestacks are not just part of the skyline. They are connected to jobs, local businesses, public services, and the town's tax base. If more of the plant shuts down, Colstrip will need something else to replace all of that. And for a small town, finding a completely new economic future is much harder than it sounds. Number 10 is Anaconda, and this is where things get genuinely alarming. Anaconda sits inside one of the largest Superfund sites in the entire United States. The old Anaconda copper smelter contaminated 300 square miles of land and over 1 billion gallons of groundwater. At peak operation, that smelter was releasing nearly 600 tons of arsenic, lead, copper, and sulfur into the air every single day, with documented tree die-off up to 22 miles away. The smelter closed in 1980 and gutted the local economy overnight. Poverty in Anaconda has been recorded as high as almost 23% in some datasets. And the smelter's 585-foot smokestack is still standing today, too massive and too structurally risky to tear down. So it was turned into a state park you can look at, but not get anywhere near. The entire town's skyline is a permanent monument to the thing that poisoned it. Number 9 is Paulson, and this one is surprising because, at first glance, Paulson looks like the kind of place people move to when they want a better life. It sits right on Flathead Lake, surrounded by beautiful water, mountains, and the kind of scenery that looks perfect in travel ads. If you only saw the photos, you would probably assume this is one of the nicest small towns in Montana. But the numbers tell a different story. Paulson has struggled with unemployment, which means a lot of people have had a hard time finding steady work. One independent ranking that compared towns across Montana actually placed Paulson at the very bottom, calling it the worst place to live in the state based on a mix of economic and quality of life factors. And that was not the only warning sign. A separate crime-based ranking later placed Paulson among the most dangerous cities in Montana. So this is a town where the view can be beautiful, but everyday life can still be difficult. You can have a lake outside your window and still worry about finding a job. That is what makes Paulson such a good example of why you should never judge a town only by how it looks. A real estate photo can show you the mountains, the water, and the sunset. It cannot show you how hard it may be to earn a living there, how safe the neighborhood feels at night, or how strong the local economy really is once you move in. Number 8 is Browning, the main town on the Blackfeet Reservation, and this place has gone through some problems that are hard to imagine for a town in modern America. The biggest example came in 2018, when Browning's local government basically ran out of money and could no longer continue operating as a normal city government. So the town officially disincorporated. In simple terms, Browning stopped functioning as an incorporated city because it could no longer afford to run itself in the usual way. That alone tells you how serious the financial situation had become. Poverty is a major problem here. A large share of residents live below the poverty line, and the situation is even harder for children, with child poverty reaching especially high levels. And then there is the weather. Browning is also famous for one of the most extreme temperature changes ever recorded anywhere in the world. So Browning has this strange combination of problems: severe poverty, a local government that once became financially unsustainable, and some of the most brutal weather ever recorded. It is the kind of place where even the history sounds extreme. Number 7 is Cut Bank, and this town has built part of its identity around one thing, and that is extreme cold. It proudly calls itself the coldest spot in the nation, and there is even a giant concrete penguin standing downtown to make sure nobody misses the point. Winters here can be brutal, and the town's record low has dropped to around 47 degrees below zero. But strangely, the cold may not even be the hardest part of living here. Recent crime rankings have placed Cut Bank among the most dangerous cities in Montana, especially when violent crime and property crime are looked at together. That is a serious concern for a town with such a small population. At the same time, household incomes are relatively low, which means many families do not have much extra money left after paying for housing, food, fuel, and other basic costs. From the outside, it is the quirky little Montana town famous for freezing weather and a giant penguin. But once you look past that, you find a place dealing with crime, limited incomes, and fewer economic opportunities than many people would expect. Number 6 is Crow Agency, the main community on the Crow Reservation, and the biggest problem here is the lack of economic opportunity. Poverty is extremely high, with more than a third of the population living below the poverty line. On paper, the average household income may not look as bad as you would expect, but there is an important reason for that. A lot of the more stable jobs in the area come from tribal government offices and public administration. Outside of that, there are very few private businesses creating large numbers of jobs. And that is where the real problem begins. A healthy town usually has different kinds of employers: shops, construction companies, restaurants, factories, service businesses, and other private companies. Crow Agency does not have enough of that variety. Some rankings have placed Crow Agency near the bottom among small towns in Montana, with unemployment reaching extremely high levels. And that tells you what life here can feel like. The problem is not just that incomes are low. It is that there are simply not enough jobs, enough businesses, or enough economic options for people to build a more secure future. Number 5 is Hardin, and this may be the strangest financial story on the entire list. Back in 2007, the town decided to build a large private detention center. The idea was simple: fill the beds, create jobs, bring money into the local economy, and give Hardin a new source of income. But there was one huge problem. The prison opened and almost nobody came. For years, the facility sat nearly empty, while the town was still responsible for the debt used to build it. And because that money had been borrowed at high interest, the debt kept growing. Things became so desperate that officials even considered using the prison to house detainees from Guantanamo Bay. That plan was rejected. Eventually, Hardin did get some federal detainees, but still not enough to make the prison work the way it was originally supposed to. And that is what makes this story so painful. A small town made a massive financial bet on one project, hoping it would save the local economy. Instead, the town was left with an expensive problem. For a place already dealing with poverty, that kind of mistake can hold the entire community back for years. Number 4 is Wolf Point, the main government center for the Fort Peck Reservation, and this town has been struggling across almost every major economic measure for years. Poverty is very high, and unemployment has also been among the worst in Montana in some statewide comparisons. Then there are the home prices. At first, very cheap homes might sound like a good thing. But in Wolf Point, low home values are not necessarily a sign of affordability. They can also mean that demand is weak because there are not enough jobs, not enough buyers, and not enough people confident enough in the local economy to invest there. Wolf Point is not dealing with just one problem. Crime is a concern. Poverty is high. Unemployment is high. Home values are low. And Wolf Point has shown up near the bottom of different Montana rankings again and again, not just for one bad year, but over a long period of time. That tells you the problems here are not temporary. They are deep, connected, and very difficult to fix when so many parts of the local economy are struggling at the same time. Number 3 is Libby, and this is where the list becomes much more serious. Libby is not here because of a weak job market or a struggling local economy. It is here because the town became the center of one of the worst asbestos disasters in American history. For years, a nearby vermiculite mine exposed workers and residents to dangerous asbestos fibers. The problem was not always obvious at the time, because asbestos can take years, even decades, to damage the lungs badly enough for people to realize something is wrong. By the time the full scale of the problem became clear, hundreds of people had already died from asbestos-related diseases, and many more were living with permanent lung damage. What makes this even more disturbing is that the danger did not end when the mine closed. People continued to receive new diagnoses years later, because the exposure had already happened long before. Entire families were affected. One local woman, Gayla Benefield, became well known for speaking about the disaster after every member of her family showed signs of asbestos exposure, and she lost her own mother to the disease. That is why Libby is different from almost every other town on this list. This was not simply a case of an industry leaving behind unemployment. The industry left behind illness. People worked there, lived there, raised children there, and in some cases were exposed just by breathing contaminated dust that had spread through the community. The situation became so severe that Libby was declared a federal public health emergency. Number 2 is Lame Deer, the main community on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and the economic situation here is extremely difficult. In one major ranking of small Montana towns, Lame Deer finished at the very bottom. The reason is not just one bad statistic. It is several problems happening at the same time. In the most recent data, both income and employment were moving in the wrong direction. What makes this even more serious is that Lame Deer is a very young community. A lot of people here are just starting their adult lives, which means they need jobs, training, housing, and a real chance to build a future close to home. But the private sector economy is very small, so there are not many businesses creating new opportunities. On top of that, the region has depended on coal money, and that source of revenue is becoming less reliable as the nearby Colstrip power plant slowly winds down. So Lame Deer is facing a difficult combination: a young population that needs more opportunity, a weak local job market, and one of the region's main sources of income becoming less secure. That is why the problem here is bigger than poverty alone. It is that an entire young generation could grow up without enough local opportunities to build a future there. And at number 1 is Fort Belknap Agency, the main community on the Fort Belknap Reservation. According to the data, this is one of the most economically distressed places in Montana. Unemployment has been extremely high, and poverty has affected a huge share of the population for years. What makes that especially troubling is that these problems are not new. They have been around for decades, which means this is not just one bad year or one temporary downturn. It is a long-term struggle. Household incomes have remained very low, and many families have had very little financial security. Even older residents, who in many places are more economically stable after a lifetime of work, face very high poverty here. That is one of the hardest parts. When a community's elders are still struggling to afford basic needs, it shows how deep the economic problems really go. Home values are also very low, but again, that does not automatically mean housing is easy to afford. On trust land, getting a normal mortgage can be much harder, which makes it more difficult for families to buy homes, build equity, and pass wealth on to the next generation. And that is the bigger problem here. Fort Belknap Agency is not just dealing with unemployment or poverty in isolation. It is dealing with a system where jobs are limited, incomes are weak, home ownership is harder, and financial stability is difficult to build across generations. That means the effect is not only on the people living there today. It can shape the future of children and families for decades. So this is not a problem affecting one age group. It reaches from children growing up with limited opportunities, to working families trying to get ahead, all the way to elders who are still struggling in retirement. That is why Fort Belknap Agency stands at number 1 on this list. So that's the list. Different towns, different stories, but the struggle underneath is often very similar. Let us know in the comments which of these 15 places surprised you the most, and I'll see you in the next one.